Hello everyone. Welcome back to Easy English Spark channel. I'm so excited to have you here today because we're diving into something that will transform your English listening and speaking skills. If you've ever struggled with conversations, hesitated before speaking, or felt stuck, you're not alone. I've been there too. But fluency isn't about memorizing words or grammar. It's about speaking naturally, confidently, and effortlessly. In this series, I'll share my personal journey from broken English to fluency, the mistakes, the breakthroughs, and the powerful techniques that actually work. So if you're ready to improve your English listening and speaking skills, build confidence, and speak more fluently than ever before, let's get started. Chapter 1. The Frustration of Broken English. I want to tell you a story, my story. A story about struggling, failing, and eventually finding a way to break free from broken English. When I was 20, I thought I knew English. I had studied it in school, memorized hundreds of words, and even passed some tests. But when it came to speaking, it was a completely different story. I could understand some English, but not much. I couldn't hold a normal conversation. My vocabulary was limited. My grammar was shaky, and my accent was so thick that even when I knew the words, people still couldn't understand me. Every time I tried to speak, I hesitated. I would think in my native language first, then try to translate my thoughts into English, but the result was always awkward. I spoke too slowly, searching for the right words. And even when I found them, my pronunciation was unclear. People often asked me to repeat myself, and sometimes they just gave up and nodded politely, pretending to understand. I still remember one painful experience that made me realize how bad my English was. I was at a store trying to buy something. I needed to ask the cashier a simple question, but I couldn't form the sentence properly. I hesitated, mumbled, and finally, after struggling for what felt like forever, I asked in broken English. The cashier frowned, not understanding what I was saying. I tried again. Still, no reaction. Then another customer, someone standing behind me, stepped forward and translated what I was trying to say. Perfectly, fluently, in the English I wished. I could speak. I felt humiliated. This was just one of many moments when I realized how much my broken English was holding me back. Job interviews were even worse. I wanted a good job, something better than labor work, but every time I applied, my weak English stopped me. The interviewers would ask me questions, and I could understand the general meaning, but I couldn't answer properly. My sentences were messy, my grammar was incorrect, and my lack of confidence made me sound even worse. One time, I applied for a customer service job. I thought I had a chance. I was friendly, hardworking, and willing to learn. But During the interview, the manager asked me, "Tell me about yourself." It was a simple question, one that any fluent English speaker could answer easily. But for me, it felt like a test I wasn't prepared for. I panicked. My mind went blank. I tried to put together a sentence, but what came out was unnatural, broken, and filled with mistakes. The manager smiled politely but quickly ended the interview. I knew I had failed. I walked out of the building feeling defeated. If I couldn't even introduce myself confidently, how could I ever work in an English-speaking environment? At that moment, I asked myself, how will I ever succeed if I can't even communicate? That question haunted me. Every day I saw people around me speaking English effortlessly. I watched them talk, laugh, and express their thoughts with confidence. I wanted to be like them, but I felt stuck, like there was an invisible barrier between me and fluency. It wasn't just about speaking. It was about feeling powerless. I avoided conversations whenever possible, afraid of embarrassing myself. When I met new people, I smiled and nodded instead of talking. If someone asked me a question, I gave short answers to avoid making mistakes. The worst part? Even when I knew what I wanted to say, my mouth wouldn't cooperate. I hesitated. I stumbled over words. I felt trapped inside my own head, unable to express my thoughts freely. I was tired of feeling this way. I wanted to change, but I didn't know how. I had already tried many things, watching English movies, reading textbooks, memorizing grammar rules, but nothing worked. My English improved slightly, but I was still far from fluent. I still couldn't speak naturally. I needed a breakthrough. And that's when I made a decision. I will either find a way to become fluent, or I will create my own way. I didn't know exactly how I would do it, but I refused to give up. I refused to accept a life where I was too afraid to speak. I was determined to find a solution, no matter how long it took. That was the moment everything changed. Little did I know, the journey ahead would teach me more than just English. It would teach me the power of persistence, the importance of the right learning strategies, and the truth about what it really takes to become fluent. And now, I want to share that journey with you. Because if I could do it, you can too. Chapter 2: Chasing the Shortcut to Fluency. After realizing how much my broken English was holding me back, I became desperate for a solution. I wanted to fix my English as quickly as possible. I didn't have years to waste. I needed fluency, and I needed it fast. I started searching for shortcuts. The internet was filled with advertisements that promised fluency in 3 months, or speak English like a native in just 30 days. Those claims seemed too good to be true, but part of me wanted to believe them. If someone else had found a fast way to learn English, why couldn't I? One night, while browsing online, I came across a program called the English Mastery Course by a so-called Fluency expert, Professor Graham. The website was full of testimonials from people who claimed they had gone from struggling to fluent in just a year. It seemed like a miracle solution. The course promised no memorization of grammar rules, no boring textbooks, just simple techniques to unlock fluency naturally. I was intrigued. This sounded exactly like what I needed. But then I saw the price, $50 per hour for private lessons. That was way more than I could afford. Still, I was curious. I wanted to know what made this program so effective. What was the secret that allowed these students to speak fluently in such a short time? I hesitated for a long time, staring at the payment page. Should I take the risk and invest in this course? What if it didn't work? What if it was just another scam? In the end, I decided against it. Not because I didn't want to learn, but because I simply couldn't afford it. However, I wasn't ready to give up. If someone had found a fast way to become fluent, that meant fluency wasn't just about talent. It was about method. If I could figure out the method, I could achieve the same results without paying thousands of dollars. Searching for the secrets of fluent speakers, I started looking for stories of people who had learned English successfully. Not native speakers, but people who had started from zero, just like me, and had managed to reach fluency. I found forums where English learners shared their experiences, and I read every post I could find. Some people said they became fluent just by watching movies. Others said they spoke English naturally after moving to an English-speaking country. Some claimed that using flashcards to memorize vocabulary was the key. But none of these methods seemed reliable. I had already tried watching movies, but I still couldn't speak fluently. I knew people who had lived in English-speaking countries for years, but still struggled to speak confidently. And I had memorized hundreds of vocabulary words, but I still couldn't form sentences properly. I needed something better. That's when I started focusing on one question. What do fluent speakers do differently? The common patterns of successful learners. As I kept searching, I noticed something interesting. Every fluent non-native speaker had followed a pattern. It wasn't about studying grammar. It wasn't about memorizing thousands of words. Instead, they all focused on one thing: immersion and repetition. They listened to native speakers constantly. They repeated what they heard over and over. They spoke out loud every day, even when no one was listening. The more I studied their methods, the clearer it became. The secret to fluency wasn't in textbooks. It was in how they practiced. They weren't just passively learning English. They were actively using it every single day. The first experiment: self-immersion. Excited by this discovery, I decided to create my own immersion system. Since I couldn't afford private lessons, I would teach myself. I downloaded podcasts in English. I watched YouTube videos where native speakers talked about everyday topics. I found recordings of real conversations and listened to them over and over. I even tried an experiment. For one entire day, I only allowed myself to consume content in English. No subtitles, no translations. Just pure English input. It was frustrating at first. I could barely understand anything. My brain felt exhausted. But then, something surprising happened. By the end of the day, my ears felt more familiar with English sounds. I started catching words and phrases that I had never noticed before. That was the moment I realized something important. Fluency wasn't just about learning English. It was about rewiring my brain to think in English. The second experiment, repetition and speaking. If immersion was the first step, then repetition had to be the second. I had read that many fluent speakers used a technique called shadowing, listening to native English speakers and repeating their words immediately, trying to match their pronunciation and rhythm. I decided to try it. I took a podcast episode and played it while walking to work. Every time I heard a sentence, I repeated it, even if I didn't understand it. At first, I felt ridiculous. I was mumbling to myself in the street, repeating words that didn't make sense to me. But after a few days, something amazing happened. I started noticing patterns, common phrases, sentence structures, natural ways of speaking. All of it started to make sense. Even though I didn't fully understand every single word, my mouth was getting used to forming English sounds. It was like learning a song. The more I repeated it, the easier it became. Why traditional learning had failed me. Looking back, I realized why my past attempts to learn English had failed. Memorizing words wasn't enough. I needed to hear them in real conversations. Studying. Grammar didn't make me fluent. I needed to practice speaking naturally. Reading textbooks was passive. I needed to actively engage with English every day. I finally understood why so many people, including myself, had spent years learning English, but still couldn't speak fluently. We were learning the wrong way. The turning point. For the first time, I felt like I was on the right path. I had discovered two powerful principles. Surround yourself with English. Immerse in native content every day. Repeat what you hear. Copy native speakers until your brain absorbs the patterns. This was a breakthrough. I no longer felt lost. I had a direction. I knew fluency wouldn't come overnight, but now I had a real plan. Instead of searching for shortcuts, I was building habits that would guarantee fluency, step by step, day by day. And little did I know, I was about to discover an even more powerful strategy that would take my speaking skills to the next level. Chapter 3: The Wrong Approach. For years I had been learning English the wrong way, and I didn't even realize it. When I was in school, I thought that studying English meant memorizing grammar rules, learning long lists of vocabulary, and passing exams. Teachers gave us worksheets filled with sentence structures, and we had to fill in the blanks with the correct verb forms. I spent hours writing down vocabulary words in a notebook, hoping that one day I would magically remember them all. I read textbooks and studied charts that explained English tenses, thinking that understanding the rules would help me speak fluently. But there was one major problem. None of this helped me actually speak English. The illusion of learning. At first, I thought I was making progress. I could recognize more words. I could read English sentences. I could answer grammar questions on tests. But when it came to real-life conversations, I was completely lost. If someone asked me a simple question in English, I would freeze. My brain would try to remember a grammar rule or search for the right vocabulary word, but by the time I thought of an answer, the conversation had already moved on. I wasn't speaking, I was translating. I realized that my knowledge of grammar wasn't helping me communicate. In fact, it was making things worse. I became too focused on speaking correctly instead of speaking naturally. I kept asking myself, why can I understand English in books but not in conversations? Why do I know so many words, but I can't form sentences quickly? Why do I feel nervous every time I try to speak? The answer was simple. I had been learning English passively instead of actively. Why my methods didn't work. I started analyzing everything I had been doing. Memorizing grammar rules instead of speaking. For years, I believed that studying grammar was the key to fluency. I learned about past tense, present perfect, conditionals, and passive voice. I knew all the technical names for different tenses, but when I tried to form a sentence, I couldn't speak naturally. Native speakers don't think about grammar rules when they talk. They just speak. But because I had learned English through grammar textbooks, I kept trying to apply rules while speaking, which made my sentences slow, unnatural, and awkward. Learning vocabulary in isolation. I had notebooks filled with English words that I had memorized, but I never knew how to use them in real conversations. I thought that knowing a lot of words would make me fluent. But when I tried to speak, I couldn't put the words together into a sentence. The problem? I had learned vocabulary without context. Native speakers don't just learn words. They learn phrases and expressions that they can use naturally in conversations. For example, Instead of memorizing the word excited, native speakers learn how to use it in sentences. I'm excited about the trip. Are you excited to meet them? But I had never learned like that. So when I tried to speak, my sentences felt robotic and unnatural. 3. Passive learning instead of active learning. For years, I thought that reading and listening were enough. I read English books, watched movies, and listened to songs. I told myself, I'm exposing myself to English. That's enough, right? But I made a critical mistake. I was just consuming English. I wasn't using it. I would read a book, but I wouldn't practice speaking. I would watch a movie, but I wouldn't repeat the dialogues. I would listen to songs, but I wouldn't try to sing along. I was absorbing English, but I wasn't producing English. Fluency is not about how much you know. It's about how much you can use. I knew a lot about English, but I couldn't use it naturally in conversations. The moment I realized I was learning the wrong way. One day, I had an embarrassing experience that changed everything. I was at a cafe and I needed to order a coffee. The cashier was a friendly guy who asked me a simple question, "How's your day going?" It was an easy question, a question I had seen in textbooks many times. But when I opened my mouth to respond, my mind went blank. I panicked. I started thinking, should I say, "It's going good," or "It's going well"? What if I use the wrong word? What tense should I use? While I was stuck overthinking, the cashier was staring at me, waiting for an answer. I felt stupid. Finally, I forced a smile and awkwardly said, Today? Good?" It was embarrassing. That night, I realized something important. Fluent speakers don't think about grammar when they speak. They just respond naturally. I had spent so much time studying English that I never actually practiced speaking English. That was my biggest mistake. The truth about fluency. That night, I made a promise to myself. I will stop learning English the wrong way. I will stop memorizing useless grammar rules. I will stop wasting time on passive learning. I realized that fluency is not about knowing everything perfectly. It's about being comfortable speaking naturally, even if you make mistakes. I needed a different approach, a better approach. I needed to start learning English the way fluent speakers did. Little did I know, I was about to discover the method that would finally change everything. Chapter 4. Learning from those who struggled like me. After realizing that I had been learning English the wrong way, I felt frustrated. Years of memorizing grammar rules, studying vocabulary lists, and reading textbooks had led me nowhere. I had spent so much time trying to speak correctly that I had never learned to speak naturally. but I refused to give up. I knew there had to be a better way. So, instead of looking at how native speakers learned English, I started looking at people like me, people who had struggled with English but had found a way to become fluent. I wanted to know, how did they do it? What did they do differently? Common mistake. Learning from native speakers. At first, I thought the best way to learn English was to study how native speakers spoke. I read books written by English teachers. I watched YouTube videos where native speakers explained pronunciation and grammar. I even bought a course that was supposed to teach me how to think in English. But something didn't feel right. Native speakers had never struggled with learning English. They didn't understand what it felt like to forget words mid-sentence or to feel embarrassed when making mistakes. They didn't have to think about sentence structure, verb tenses, or pronunciation rules. They just spoke. That's when I realized learning from native speakers wasn't helping me because they never experienced the struggle I was facing. If I wanted to learn English effectively, I needed to learn from people who had been where I was. I needed to find people who had learned English as a second language and had successfully become fluent. Finding the people who had succeeded. So I started searching. I went on forums where people shared their language learning experiences. I read books written by successful English learners. I watched videos of non-native speakers who had mastered English. And then I found something that changed my entire approach. I discovered Lucas Tan, a businessman from Singapore who had grown up speaking Mandarin, but later became fluent in English. He had struggled with pronunciation, grammar, and confidence, just like me. But by the time he was in his late 20s, he spoke English so fluently that people thought he was a native speaker. I was fascinated. I wanted to know, how did he do it? The key to fluency, repetition, and imitation. I read an interview with Lucas, and one thing stood out to me. He didn't learn English by studying grammar or memorizing vocabulary. He learned it by repeating what he heard, over and over again. He said, "I didn't focus on grammar. I didn't worry about making mistakes. I just copied native speakers. I listened to the same sentences again and again until they became natural to me." That was his secret. Instead of spending years studying rules, he focused on practical learning. He listened to native speakers, repeated their words, and trained his brain to think in English. Why repetition works. At first, I didn't understand why repetition was so important. But then I thought about how children learn to speak. When babies learn their first language, they don't memorize grammar rules or study vocabulary lists. They just listen and repeat. They hear their parents say phrases like, "Come here," or "Let's go," hundreds of times before they start saying them on their own. Their brains absorb patterns naturally through repetition. I realized that I, had been learning English in a way that was completely unnatural. Instead of practicing speaking, I had been trying to memorize English like a school subject. That was my mistake. To become fluent, I needed to train my brain the way children do, through constant exposure and repetition. My first experiment with repetition. Excited by this discovery, I decided to test Lucas Tan's method. I chose a short podcast episode in English, just 5 minutes long. I listened to it once, trying to understand as much as I could. Then I played it again and again, at least 10 times. The first few times, I struggled. There were words I didn't recognize. Some sentences felt too fast. But by the 10th time, something amazing happened. I started predicting the sentences before they were spoken. My brain was absorbing the rhythm and structure of English without me even trying. Then, I took it a step further. I started repeating the sentences out loud while listening. At first, I mumbled the words. Then I spoke louder, trying to match the speaker's pronunciation and intonation. By the end of the day, I could say the I'm entire 5-minute podcast episode from memory. For the first time, English felt natural. The shift in my thinking. That day changed everything. Realize that fluency wasn't about how much English you know. It was about how much English you can recall instantly. And the only way to recall English instantly is through repetition and imitation. Native speakers don't think about grammar, rules when they speak, because they have heard the same phrases thousands of times. If I wanted to speak English fluently, I needed to do the same. I needed to train my mouth and brain to recognize and produce English naturally, without overthinking. Repetition versus traditional learning. At this point, I compared my new method with my old way of learning. Before, I studied grammar rules. Now, I focused on listening and repeating. Before, I memorized vocabulary lists. Now, I learned words inside real sentences. Before, I read English silently. Now, I spoke out loud every single day. I stopped treating English like a school subject and started treating it like a skill, something that needed practice, not just knowledge. Building my own fluency system. Over the next few weeks, I developed a daily routine based on what I had learned from Lucas Tan and other successful English learners. Pick a short piece of English audio, a podcast, TV show clip, or interview. Listen to it at least 10 times. Repeat the sentences out loud while listening. Mimic the speaker's tone, pronunciation, and speed. Practice daily until the sentences feel natural. It was a simple system, but it worked. Every day, I felt my English improving. Words that used to feel difficult became effortless. Sentences flowed more smoothly. My confidence grew, and for the first time in my life, I started thinking in English instead of translating from my native language. The moment of realization. One day, after a few months of practicing, something incredible happened. I was walking down the street when a tourist stopped me and asked for directions in English. Without hesitating, I answered smoothly, "Oh, you just need to go straight for 2 blocks, then turn left. You'll see it on your right." After the tourist thanked me and walked away, I froze. I had just spoken English without thinking. That was the moment I knew I was finally on the path to fluency. The lesson I learned. Fluency doesn't come from studying textbooks or memorizing vocabulary. It comes from listening, repeating, and using English daily. I had spent years learning English the wrong way, but now I had found a method that actually worked. And from that moment forward, I promised myself I will never go back to the old way of learning, because fluency wasn't about talent. It was about using the right method. Chapter 5. The Breakthrough on the Subway. After months of struggling, searching, and experimenting with different learning methods, I finally felt like I was onto something. I had discovered the power of repetition, listening, and mimicking native speakers. But I still had one big problem. I didn't have time. Like most people, my schedule was packed. I had work, responsibilities, and barely any free time to sit down and study English the way I wanted. That's when I realized something important. If I wanted to improve, I had to use the time I already had. And that's when I found my secret. Weapon for fluency. The subway. Turning dead time into learning time. Every day I spent nearly 2 hours commuting to and from work. That was 2 hours of wasted time where I wasn't doing anything productive. One morning, as I sat on the subway staring at my phone, I thought, what if I use this time to practice English? That simple thought changed everything. Instead of scrolling through social media, I plugged in my headphones and started listening to English podcasts. At first, I just listened, but soon I realized that listening alone wasn't enough. I needed to speak. So, I started whispering along with the speakers, would listen to a sentence, then repeat it immediately. At first, I felt ridiculous. I was worried that people around me would think I was crazy. But then I realized something. The subway was loud. With the noise of the train, announcements, and people talking, no one could hear me. That meant I had found the perfect place to practice speaking English without fear. The first weeks, struggling to keep up. The first few weeks were tough. I listened to news reports, interviews, and conversations, but the speakers talked too fast. I could barely keep up. Sometimes I would repeat a sentence only to realize that I had completely mispronounced the words. Other times I couldn't even finish repeating a sentence before the next one started. But I didn't stop. Every morning and every evening, I forced myself to practice. I told myself, it doesn't matter if I make mistakes. It doesn't matter if I sound terrible. I just need to keep going. Day by day, I got a little better. I started catching more words. I became faster at repeating sentences. My pronunciation slowly improved. A new strategy. The shadowing technique. One day, I came across a technique called shadowing. The idea was simple. Listen to a native speaker. Repeat exactly what they say immediately, without pausing. Match their pronunciation, rhythm, and tone. It sounded easy, but it was much harder than I expected. The first time I tried it, I failed completely. I couldn't keep up. The sentences were too fast, and my words sounded nothing like the speaker's. But instead of quitting, I adjusted my approach. I slowed things down. I picked short clips, only 30 seconds long, and listened to them over and over until I could shadow them perfectly. Then I increased the difficulty. I practiced with longer clips, faster speakers, and more complex conversations. And something incredible started happening. The subway became my classroom. With each day of practice, I felt my English improving. My tongue got used to forming English sounds. My brain started recognizing sentence structures automatically. My speaking speed increased. One morning, I realized that I was shadowing entire news reports fluently. I wasn't just repeating words. I was speaking naturally, with rhythm and confidence. That was the moment I knew. I had finally found the method that worked for me. The subway wasn't just a way to get to work anymore. It was my classroom, my practice ground, and for the first time in my life, I felt excited to speak English. Overcoming my fear of speaking. Before I started practicing on the subway, I had always been afraid to speak English. I was scared of making mistakes. I worried that people would laugh at me. I hesitated, overthinking every sentence. But after weeks of speaking out loud every day, something changed. I stopped caring about making mistakes. I stopped translating in my head before speaking. I stopped hesitating. Speaking English became as natural as breathing. The unexpected test. Talking to a stranger. One evening, I was on my way home when a tourist sat next to me and asked for directions. He said, "Excuse me, do you know how to get to the museum?" Without even thinking, I responded fluently, "Yeah, sure. You just need to get off at the next station and take a right when you exit. The museum is about 5 minutes from there." The tourist smiled and said, "Wow, your English is really Good. That was when it hit me. I had answered him without hesitation, without translating, without fear. I had spent so many years struggling to speak English, and now, without even realizing it, I had spoken effortlessly. That night, I couldn't stop smiling. I had finally broken through the fear. I had finally learned to speak English. Naturally, the key lessons I learned. Looking back, I realized that my breakthrough happened because I changed the way I learned. I stopped learning English passively. Instead of just listening, I started speaking every single day. I stopped worrying about mistakes. Instead of hesitating, I focused on imitating native speakers as much as possible. I used my free time wisely. Instead of wasting time on social media, I turned my daily commute into a powerful learning opportunity. And most importantly, I practiced consistently. Fluency doesn't come overnight. It comes from daily effort, small improvements, and never giving up. The moment I knew I was fluent. A few months after I started practicing on the subway, something incredible happened. I was watching an American TV show without subtitles, and suddenly I realized I was understanding everything, not just the words, not just the basic meaning. I understood the jokes, the sarcasm, the cultural references. I had finally trained my brain to think in English, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like an outsider struggling with a foreign language. Felt fluent. Your journey starts now. If you're struggling with English like I did, I want you to remember this. You don't need to be perfect. Just start speaking. You don't need a classroom. Use your daily life as your practice ground. You don't need years of studying. You just need the right method and consistent effort. If I could go from fearful and broken English to confident and fluent, so can you. Your breakthrough moment is waiting. All you have to do is start today. Chapter 6. The First Signs of Success. For months, I had been practicing English every single day. I had turned my subway rides into study sessions, shadowed native speakers, and forced myself to speak out loud, even when I didn't feel confident. I didn't expect immediate results. In fact, I had prepared myself for slow progress. But then, something unexpected happened. I started noticing small victories. At first, they were so subtle that I almost didn't realize them. But looking back, these small moments were the first. Real signs that my English was improving. And those small victories, they changed everything. The first time I understood without translating. One morning, I was listening to a podcast, just like I did every day. Normally, I had to pause the audio frequently to process what was being said. Sometimes, I even repeated sentences multiple times before I understood their meaning. But on this particular morning, something strange happened. I was halfway through the episode when I suddenly realized I had been understanding everything without stopping. I hadn't paused. I hadn't rewound. I hadn't needed to translate in my head. For the first time, English felt natural. I was shocked. I rewound the podcast and listened again, wondering if maybe it was just an easy episode. But no, it was just like every other episode I had struggled with before. The difference wasn't in the podcast. The difference was in me. I had spent so much time listening, repeating, and shadowing that my brain had finally adapted. I had rewired my mind to process English like a native speaker. The day I spoke without hesitating. That same week, I had another breakthrough. I was at work when my coworker, Ethan, walked up to me. He was a friendly guy who often tried to chat with me. But in the past, I had always kept my responses short because I was afraid of making mistakes. But this time was different. Ethan asked, "Hey, did you see the new action movie that just came out?" And instead of my usual one-word answer, I instantly responded, "Yeah. I watched it last weekend. It was amazing. The action scenes were crazy, and the story was better than I expected." The moment I finished my sentence, I froze. I had spoken naturally, no hesitation, no translating in my head, no awkward pauses. Ethan didn't even react like it was a big deal. He just continued the conversation like it was normal. But to me, it was a huge moment. I felt something I had never felt before when speaking English. I felt free. My first compliment from a native speaker. A few days later, I was grabbing lunch when something incredible happened. I was ordering food at a small restaurant. Normally, ordering was stressful for me. I worried about my pronunciation, and I always rehearsed my order in my head before speaking. But this time, I didn't think. I just spoke. The cashier, a native English speaker, smiled and asked, "Where are you from?" I told her where I was from, expecting her to comment on my accent like people usually did, but instead she said, "Your English is really good. How long have you been here?" For a second, I didn't know how to respond. No one had ever said that to me before. I had spent years feeling embarrassed about my English. I had been terrified of speaking because I thought I sounded terrible. And now, a native speaker was complimenting me. That moment gave me a huge confidence boost. For the first time, I started to believe that fluency wasn't just possible, it was happening. The turning point, recording myself. Even though I was noticing progress, I still had doubts. Had I really improved, or was I just imagining it? To find out, I decided to record myself speaking. I took out my phone, pressed record, and started talking. I talked about my day, my thoughts, and what I had been learning. It felt strange at first, but I kept going. Then, I played the recording back, and I couldn't believe what I heard. My voice sounded more natural. My sentences were smoother. My pronunciation was clearer. Sure, I still had an accent. Sure, I still made some small mistakes. But compared to how I used to sound, the difference was huge. That recording was proof that I was improving. It was proof that all the hours of practice were working, and it motivated me to keep going. How my confidence changed everything. The more I practiced, the more my confidence grew. And as my confidence grew, I started speaking more. I stopped avoiding conversations with native speakers. I stopped hesitating before speaking. I stopped feeling embarrassed about my mistakes. And something incredible happened. The more I spoke, the better I got. Speaking English no longer felt like something I had to prepare for. It just became part of my life. A new challenge. Thinking in English. Now that I was seeing real progress, I wanted to take things to the next level. I had heard people say that thinking in English was the key to true fluency, but I had no idea how to do it. So I decided to start small. Every day, I made a rule for myself. Whenever I had a thought, I would try to express it in English. If I was walking down the street, I would describe what I saw in English in my head. If I was making a decision, I would think about it in English instead of my native language. At first, it was difficult. My brain naturally wanted to think in my first language, but the more I practiced, the easier it became. Within a few weeks, I noticed something incredible. I was thinking in English without forcing it. That was when I realized I wasn't just learning English anymore. I was living it. The biggest lesson I learned. Looking back, I realized that my success wasn't because I was smart or talented. It was because I changed the way I learned. Instead of memorizing grammar rules, I focused on speaking. Instead of studying passively, I practiced every day. Instead of being afraid of mistakes, I embraced them as part of the process. And most importantly, I didn't give up. There were days when I felt stuck. There were times when I felt like I wasn't improving, but I kept going. And little by little, English stopped feeling like a foreign language. It became part of me. If you're struggling, remember this. Fluency doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't come from textbooks or classrooms. It comes from consistent, daily practice. If you feel frustrated, if you feel like you're not improving, keep going. Because one day you'll wake up and realize that something has changed. One day you'll have a conversation without hesitating. 1. Day. A native speaker will compliment your English. One day, you'll record yourself and be shocked at how much better you sound. And on that day, you'll realize that you're not just learning English anymore. You're becoming fluent. Chapter 7. The Open Voice Method. As I continued my journey to English fluency, I noticed that my confidence was growing, my ability to think in English was improving, and my speaking speed was getting faster. But something still wasn't right. Even though I could speak more fluently than before, my pronunciation still felt unnatural. Sometimes native speakers had to ask me to repeat myself. Sometimes I could tell that people were straining to understand what I was saying. And even though I was speaking faster, I still sounded like a foreigner struggling with English. That's when I realized it wasn't just about the words I was saying. It was about how I was saying them. And that realization led me to one of the most powerful discoveries of my entire journey. The open voice method. The problem: speaking from the throat. For years I had been speaking English the same way I spoke my native language, using my throat. Many non-native speakers do this without realizing it. When we speak in our first language, our voice usually comes from the throat, because that's how our muscles have been trained since childhood. But English is different. Native English speakers don't speak from their throat. They speak from their chest and diaphragm. When I compared my voice to native speakers, I noticed that their voices sounded full and clear, resonant and natural, smooth and easy to understand. Meanwhile, my voice sounded tight and restricted, nasal and flat, unclear and hard to hear. I wasn't speaking with my full voice. I was only using a small part of my vocal capacity, and that was a major reason why my English still sounded unnatural. The solution: speaking with an open voice. One day, I stumbled upon a video of a professional speech coach talking about public speaking. He explained that great speakers don't just talk, they project their voice. They open their throat, use their diaphragm, and let their voice flow freely. That's when it hit me. Native English speakers sound so natural because they don't restrict their voice. They let it come from deep inside their chest, not from their throat. And that was exactly what I needed to do. So I started training myself to speak with an open voice. Step 1. Breathing from the diaphragm. The first thing I needed to change was my breathing. Most non-native speakers, including me at the time, tend to breathe shallowly. We take small breaths using our chest instead of deep breaths from our diaphragm. The diaphragm is a large muscle below your lungs. When you use it to breathe, your stomach expands, and your lungs fill with more air. This is how singers, actors, and great speakers produce strong, clear voices. I started practicing diaphragmatic breathing every morning. I stood up straight and relaxed my shoulders. I took a deep breath in through my nose, making sure my stomach expanded. I exhaled slowly through my mouth, keeping my throat open. I repeated this 10 times to train my body to breathe deeply. At first, it felt unnatural, but after a few days, I started noticing that my voice sounded stronger and clearer when I spoke. Step 2. Opening my throat. The next step was to remove tension from my throat. I had spent years speaking with a tight throat, and I didn't even realize it. This made my voice sound weak and nasal. To fix this, I practiced throat relaxation exercises. Yawning. I opened my mouth wide and yawned deeply to stretch my throat. Humming. I hummed while keeping my throat relaxed to feel the vibrations in my chest, speaking in a deep voice. I lowered my voice slightly and focused on letting my voice resonate in my chest instead of my throat. After a week of practicing these exercises, I felt a major difference. I could finally feel my voice vibrating in my chest instead of getting stuck in my throat. And suddenly, my English started sounding more natural. Step 3. Speaking with energy and flow. Once I had learned to breathe deeply and open my throat, I needed to work on my energy and rhythm. Many non-native speakers speak too softly or too monotonously. Native speakers, on the other hand, use energy, emotion, and variation in their voice. I started training this by practicing speaking with different emotions. I took simple sentences like, "I don't know what happened." "That's amazing." "I can't believe this." And I practiced saying them with excitement, curiosity, frustration, happiness. The goal was to bring life into my voice instead of speaking flatly. At first, it felt strange. I had spent years speaking English in a robotic way, so adding energy felt unnatural. But after a few weeks, I noticed that my speech had completely transformed. My voice had more personality. My words flowed more naturally. My English finally sounded alive. The first time someone noticed the change. One day I was practicing my English at home when my friend Alex stopped me. He looked at me and said, "Hey, your voice sounds different. It sounds stronger." I laughed and asked what he meant. He said, "Before, you sounded like you were struggling to push words out. But now, your voice sounds natural, like a real English speaker." That was the moment I knew the open voice method was working. I wasn't just speaking English anymore. I was owning my English. How the open voice method changed my life. After training my voice for a few months, I noticed huge improvements. My pronunciation was clearer and easier to understand. My voice sounded stronger and more confident. Native speakers stopped asking me to repeat myself. I felt more natural and relaxed when speaking English. And the best part? I finally sounded like myself. I wasn't just copying native speakers anymore. I was using my own voice in English, and it felt incredible. The lesson: your voice is your power. If you're struggling with pronunciation, confidence, or fluency, I want you to remember this. Your voice is your power. It's not just about the words you say, it's about how you say them. If you want to sound more natural in English, focus on breathing deeply from your diaphragm, keeping your throat open, and relaxed, speaking with energy, rhythm, and confidence. When you do this, your English will no longer sound weak or unnatural. It will sound powerful, clear, and effortless. And most importantly, it will sound like you. So open your throat, take a deep breath, and speak with confidence, because the world is waiting to hear your voice. Chapter 8: The One-Word Secret to Fluency. After months of intense practice, I had made incredible progress. My pronunciation was clearer, my confidence had skyrocketed, and my ability to speak naturally had improved more than I ever imagined. But, deep down, I still felt like I was missing something. I had spent so much time analyzing techniques, learning strategies, and testing different methods. But what if fluency wasn't about complex strategies at all? What if there was one simple thing that could determine whether someone became fluent or not? I thought about all the successful language learners I had studied. People who had started from zero but managed to reach near native levels of fluency. What did they all have in common? And then it hit me. There was one word, one simple word that made the difference between people who became fluent and people who gave up. That word was practice, the myth of natural talent. For years, I had believed that some people were just naturally good at languages. I looked at fluent English speakers and thought, maybe they have a special gift. Maybe their brains just work differently. But I was wrong. When I studied the journeys of fluent speakers, especially non-native speakers who had learned English later in life, I noticed something important. None of them were born fluent. They weren't special. They weren't geniuses. They simply practiced more than everyone else. They didn't just study English. They didn't just read about English. They used English every single day. And that made all the difference. The harsh truth about fluency. If you ask most people why they aren't fluent in English, they'll give you excuses. I don't have time. I'm too old. English is too hard. I'm just not good at languages. But the truth is simple. If you don't practice, you won't improve. You can spend years memorizing vocabulary. You can read every grammar book ever written. You can watch thousands of English movies, but if you don't open your mouth and speak, you will never become fluent. Because fluency doesn't come from knowing English. Fluency comes from using English. Why? Most people never become fluent. I started thinking about the people I knew who had been learning English for years but still weren't fluent. They had spent years in school studying English. They had taken expensive courses. Some had even moved to English-speaking countries. But they still struggled to hold a conversation. Why? Because they weren't practicing consistently. Some of them practiced for a few weeks, then stopped when they didn't see immediate results. Some of them only practiced in the classroom, but never spoke English in real life. Some of them were too afraid of making mistakes, so they avoided speaking altogether. And all of them had one thing in common. They weren't using English every day. The difference between people who become fluent and people who don't isn't intelligence. It isn't memory. It isn't talent. It's consistent, daily practice. The rule of 1% improvement. At this point in my journey, I started thinking differently about fluency. Instead of worrying about becoming fluent quickly, I focused on improving by just 1% every day. Because if I improved by just 1% each day in 1 year, I would be 37 times better than when I started. That's how fluency works. It's not about sudden transformations. It's about small daily improvements that add up over time. And the only way to improve every day is to practice every day. My fluency practice routine. At this point, I made a promise to myself. Every single day, I will practice English. No matter how busy I am, no matter how tired I feel. No excuses. I created a simple system to make sure I practiced consistently. Speaking practice. Every morning. Every morning, I spoke out loud for 5 minutes. I talked about my plans for the day. I described things around me in English. I told a short story about something that had happened recently. It didn't matter if no one was listening. The goal was to get my mouth used to speaking English every day. Listening and shadowing during commutes. On my way to work, I listened to an English podcast or an audiobook. Instead of just listening, I practiced shadowing, repeating what the speaker said immediately, copying their pronunciation and intonation. Thinking in English throughout the day. Whenever I had a thought, I forced myself to think in English instead of my native language. If I was hungry, I thought, what should I eat today? If I saw a dog on the street, I thought, that's a cute dog. I wonder what breed it is. I trained my brain to default to English. Writing practice before bed. At night, I wrote one short paragraph in English. Sometimes I wrote about my day. Sometimes I wrote a quick summary of a story I had read. Sometimes I just wrote random thoughts. The goal wasn't to write perfect sentences. The goal was to express my thoughts in English without hesitation. The power of consistency. At first, I didn't see immediate results, but after a few weeks, I noticed something amazing. My speaking speed increased, my listening comprehension improved, my fear of making mistakes disappeared, and the best part? It felt easy. Speaking English wasn't something I had to prepare for anymore. It had become a natural part of my life. The moment I knew practice was the key. One evening, I was talking to a friend when he said something that shocked me. "Your English sounds different now. It's so natural. What have you been doing?" That's when I realized my daily practice was working. I hadn't done anything extraordinary. I hadn't taken expensive courses. I hadn't memorized thousands of words. I had simply practiced every single day. The one-word secret to fluency. If you take nothing else from my journey, remember this. Fluency is not about knowledge. It's about practice. If you want to become fluent, don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't wait until you feel ready. Don't wait until your English is good enough. Just start practicing. Even if you feel embarrassed. Even if you make mistakes. Even if you only have 10 minutes a day. Because every time you practice, you're getting better. And one day, without even realizing it, you'll wake up and realize you're fluent. Chapter 9. The 3-step fluency formula. By this point in my journey, I had discovered a lot about what it really takes to become fluent in English. I had made mistakes. I had wasted time on ineffective methods. I had searched for shortcuts and realized they didn't exist. But most importantly, I had found what actually works. And when I looked back, I realized that every breakthrough I had made in my fluency journey could be summarized in just 3 simple steps. This was the formula. The same formula that allowed me to go from struggling with broken English to speaking with confidence. And today, I'm going to share it with you. If you follow this formula, fluency isn't a question of if, it's just a question of when. Step 1. Set your goal. If you don't know where you're going, you'll never get there. Most people say, "I want to be fluent in English." But what does that even mean? Fluency isn't a destination. It's a skill that develops over time. And the clearer you are about what fluency means to you, the faster you'll get there. Instead of saying, "I want to be fluent," ask yourself, what exactly do I want to achieve? What kind of conversations do I want to have? Why do I want to improve my English? For example, here's how I set my goals when I started. Be able to have a 10-minute conversation without hesitating. Understand native speakers without needing subtitles. express my ideas clearly without translating in my head. These were specific, measurable goals. I knew exactly what I was working toward, so I could track my progress. So take a moment right now and ask yourself, what is your English fluency goal? Write it down. Be specific. Because if you don't define your goal, you'll never know if you're making progress. Step 2. Take action every day. This is where most people fail. They set a goal, they feel motivated, but then they don't take consistent action. They watch English movies and call it studying. They memorize vocabulary lists but never actually use the words. They listen to English, but they never practice speaking. And after a few months, they wonder why they still can't speak fluently. The truth is, fluency isn't about how much you know. It's about how much you practice. If you want to get fluent, you need to make English part of your daily life. Here's how I did it. Speak every day, even if you're alone. When I first started, I didn't have anyone to practice with, so I made a simple rule. Every day, I would talk to myself in English. Would describe what I was doing. I'm making breakfast. I need to add some salt to the eggs. I would tell stories to myself. Yesterday, I saw something funny on my way home. I would even practice arguing with myself. I think this is a good idea because... No, actually, I disagree because it felt strange at first, but within weeks, I started speaking faster and more naturally. The best part? You don't need a partner to do this. You can start right now. Listen and repeat. Shadowing technique. The second thing I did was shadowing. This is when you listen to a native speaker and repeat what they say immediately, copying their pronunciation and rhythm. I did this every day with podcasts, YouTube videos, audiobooks. At first, I couldn't keep up. The speakers talked too fast, and my pronunciation was terrible. But after a few weeks, I noticed a huge improvement. My pronunciation was clearer, and my speaking speed increased naturally. The best part? I wasn't thinking about grammar. I was just speaking. 3. Think in English. Before I discovered this trick, I used to translate everything in my head. I would think in my native language, then try to convert my thoughts into English. But this made my speech slow and unnatural. So I forced myself to start thinking in English. How? I started with simple thoughts. I need to buy some milk. It's a nice day today. Then I moved to longer sentences. After work, I need to go to the store and buy some groceries. Then I started internal conversations in English. Instead of just thinking, I need coffee, I would talk to myself in my head. I feel really tired today. Maybe I should get a coffee, but I already had 2 cups. Maybe I should drink water. Instead, the more I did this, the faster I could form sentences when speaking. This was one of the most powerful changes I made. Step 3. Follow through until you succeed. This is where most people give up. They practice for a few weeks. They don't see immediate results and they quit. They think, maybe I'm just not good at languages. But here's the truth. Fluency takes time. It's like going to the gym. If you work out for 2 weeks and don't see muscles, does that mean it's impossible? No. It means you need to keep going. The same applies to English. Every day you practice, even if you don't see progress, you are getting better. Even on days when you feel like you're not improving, your brain is still learning. The secret is simple. Don't stop. The Fluency formula in action. Looking back, I realized that every successful English learner follows this exact same formula. Set a clear goal. Know what you're working toward. Take action every day. Speak, listen, think in English. Follow through until you succeed. Never stop. That's it. No magic tricks, no secret shortcuts. Just consistent daily practice. The moment I knew it. Worked. One day, I was talking with a native speaker when I suddenly realized I wasn't thinking about English anymore. The words were just coming out naturally. I wasn't translating in my head. I wasn't hesitating. I was just speaking. That's when I knew I was finally fluent. And it all happened because I followed this simple 3-step formula. If you want to be fluent, start today. Now, it's your turn. If you've been struggling with English, stop waiting for the perfect time. Set a goal, take action, and follow through. Because fluency isn't something you get. Fluency is something you build, and every single day you practice, you're getting one step closer. So start today. Because 6 months from now, you'll either be fluent or you'll still be making excuses. The choice is yours. Chapter 10. Speaking like a native. After months of practice, I had reached a point where I could speak English with confidence. I could hold conversations without hesitating, think in English without translating, and understand native speakers in real-life situations. But even though I had come so far, something still bothered me. I didn't just want to be fluent. I wanted to sound natural. I wanted people to talk to me without slowing down or simplifying their words. I wanted native speakers to feel comfortable speaking to me the same way they spoke to each other. I wanted to blend in, to sound like I truly belonged. That's when I realized fluency is one thing. Sounding like a native is another. And if I wanted to speak like a native, I had to go beyond just learning words and grammar. I had to master the rhythm, tone, and flow of real English conversations. What does it mean to speak like a native? Before I started training myself to sound more natural, I asked myself, what exactly makes a native speaker sound different from a non-native speaker? When I listened closely, I noticed some key differences. Native speakers use contractions and reductions. Instead of saying, I am going to the store, they say, I'm going to the store. I'm gonna go to the store. They connect their words together. Instead of saying, did you eat? They say, did you eat? Do you eat? They use natural pauses and intonation. Instead of speaking in a monotone, they change their pitch and speed depending on the emotion they want to express. They use everyday expressions and slang. Instead of saying, that is very funny, they say, that's hilarious. That cracked me up. The more I studied native speakers, the more I realized it wasn't just about pronunciation, it was about flow, rhythm, and natural speech. Patterns. Step 1. Mastering contractions and reductions. One of the biggest reasons non-native speakers sound unnatural is that we often pronounce every single word clearly and separately. But native speakers don't talk like that. They shorten and reduce words to make speech faster and smoother. For example, full sentence, how natives say it. What are you doing? What you doing? Do you want to go? Do you want to go? I don't know. I don't know. Give me that. Give me that. Let me see. Let me see. I have gotta go. I gotta go. At first, I resisted speaking like this because I thought it sounded lazy or incorrect. But then, I realized this is how real people talk. If I wanted to sound natural, I needed to embrace contractions and reductions. Step 2. Connecting words for a smooth flow. The next step was learning connected speech. Native speakers don't pronounce each word separately. Instead, they blend words together, making their speech sound smooth and fluid. For example, full sentence connected. Speech. What do you want? What do you want? I have to go. I have to go. Did you see it? Did you see it? Don't you know? Don't you know? When I first tried to speak this way, it felt strange and unnatural. But the more I practiced, the more natural it felt. I wasn't just pronouncing words. I was flowing through sentences like a native. Step 3. Learning native intonation and rhythm. One of the biggest differences between native and non-native speakers is intonation, the rise and fall of pitch when speaking. Non-native speakers often sound flat and robotic because they use the same tone for every sentence. But native speakers use intonation to express emotions and attitudes. For example, the sentence, "Are you serious?" can have different meanings depending on the tone. Excited. Are you serious? Wow, I can't believe it. Doubtful. Are you serious? I don't believe you. Angry. Are you serious? I'm upset about this. To train my intonation, I practiced imitating native speakers from movies, TV shows, and interviews. I paid attention to when their pitch went up or down, how they emphasized certain words, where they paused naturally. Didn't just practice words, I practiced the music of English. Step 4. Using common native expressions. To sound like a native, I knew I had to stop speaking like a textbook and start speaking like a real person. That meant learning common expressions, slang, and idioms. For example, instead of saying I agree with you, native speakers say, totally. I'm with you on that. No doubt. Instead of saying I'm very tired, they say I'm exhausted. I'm beat. I'm running on empty. Instead of saying that is funny, they say that's hilarious. That cracked me up. I almost died laughing. At first, I felt awkward using these expressions, but the more I used them, the more natural they became. And soon, I wasn't just speaking English. I was speaking like a native. The moment I knew I had done it. One day, I was having a conversation with a native speaker. At the end of our conversation, he said something that I will never forget. I wouldn't have guessed that English isn't your first language. For years, I had dreamed of hearing those words. It was proof that all my practice, the contractions, the connected speech, the intonation, the slang, had finally paid off. I didn't just sound fluent, I sounded natural. The final lesson: fluency versus native-like speaking. Looking back, I realized there are two levels of fluency. Basic fluency. You can speak clearly, express your thoughts, and understand native speakers. Native-like fluency. You sound exactly like a native speaker, with natural rhythm, expressions, and pronunciation. Most people stop at basic fluency. But if you want to truly blend in, if you want people to forget that English is your second language, you need to go beyond just learning words. You need to master the flow, the rhythm, and the culture of the language, and that's what separates good speakers from great speakers. Final words. If I can do it, so can you. If you're reading this and thinking, I'll never sound like a native, let me tell you something. Used to think that too, but I proved myself wrong, and if I can do it, so can you. Start small. Practice every day. Immerse yourself in the sounds of English. And one day, when you least expect it, someone will say to you, "Wait, you're not a native speaker." I never would have guessed, and that moment will make all the effort worth it. Final words. Your journey starts now. Looking back on my journey, I realize how much I have changed, not just in my English skills, but in my mindset, confidence, and outlook on life. When I first started, I struggled with every sentence. I hesitated before speaking. I was afraid of making mistakes. I felt like I would never be able to express myself freely in English. But step by step, day by day, I kept going. There were days when I felt like I wasn't improving. There were moments when I wanted to give up. There were times when I doubted myself and thought, maybe I'll never be fluent. But something inside me refused to quit. And now, after all the effort, the struggles, and the breakthroughs, I can confidently say it was worth it. The ability to speak English fluently has opened doors for me that I never imagined. It has given me confidence in my career, my relationships, and my daily life. It has allowed me to connect with people from all over the world. But the truth is, I am not special. I am not more talented than anyone else. I am not naturally gifted at languages. I didn't have a secret trick or a shortcut. The only difference between me and those who never become fluent is one simple thing. I kept practicing, no matter what. Your fluency is in your hands. If you're reading this right now, you might still be struggling with English. Maybe you feel frustrated. Maybe you feel stuck. Maybe you feel like you'll never reach fluency. But I promise you this. Fluency is possible. Not just for people who are naturally good at languages. Not just for people who have lived in an English-speaking country. Not just for people who have been learning for years. Fluency is possible for you, but here's the truth. No one is going to do it for you. No teacher, no course, no book, no video can make you fluent. They can only guide you. They can only give you the tools. But the real work, the practice, the consistency, the effort, that's up to you. If you want to speak English fluently, you need to make a decision. You need to say to yourself, I'm going to do this. Not, I'll try. Not, maybe one day. Not, I hope so. I will become fluent. Because once you make that decision, nothing can stop you. The biggest mistake most people make. Most people never reach fluency because they make one big mistake. They stop too soon. They practice for a few weeks, don't see results, and give up. They get discouraged by mistakes and stop trying. They wait for the perfect time to start, but that time never comes. And years later, they're still stuck in the same place, still wishing they were fluent. But here's the thing. If you just keep going, you will get there. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but 6 months from now, 1 year from now, if you practice every day, you will be fluent. The 1-year challenge, your path to fluency. If you truly want to become fluent, I challenge you to do this. For the next 365 days, commit to practicing English every single day. It doesn't matter if it's 10 minutes or 2 hours. It doesn't matter if you're busy. It doesn't matter if you don't feel like it. Just do something in English every day. Here's what your daily practice could look like. Morning. Speak for 5 minutes about your day. Commute. Listen to an English podcast and shadow. The speaker. During the day, think in English instead of your native language. Evening. Watch a YouTube video and repeat key phrases out loud. Before bed, write a short journal entry in English. It doesn't have to be perfect. You just need to keep going. And if you do this for 1 full year, I guarantee your speaking will become faster and smoother. Your pronunciation will sound more natural. You will stop translating in your head. You will finally feel fluent. The only question is, will you accept the challenge? Your journey starts now. The moment you finish reading this, you have 2 choices. You can close this and go back to your old habits. 2. You can take action and start practicing right now. The choice is yours. You can spend the next year wishing you were fluent, or you can spend the next year becoming fluent. You already know the path. Now all you have to do is walk it. So don't wait. Don't overthink it. Just start. Because your fluency journey starts now. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.